Okay, so you've given us some really fascinating stuff here. We're going to be taking a deep dive into this material about the specific time and community in South Africa.
Yeah, and our goal really is to try to understand the core of this story,
Mhm.
you know? Really extract those key insights from these documents so you come away with a really clear understanding without getting bogged down, you know,
Right.
in all the little details.
And at the heart of this deep dive is the Afrikaner community in South Africa,
Hmm.
specifically looking at 3 generations of this Duet family.
Yeah.
And their story unfolds during these huge historical events, the Depression,
Yeah.
the Second Anglo-Boer War,
Hmm.
even going back to the abolition of slavery in the Cape Colony.
Hmm.
We've got personal reflections, we've got historical context, like the Carnegie Commission report.
Hmm.
And then this narrative that feels incredibly vivid because it's based in archival research.
Yeah, it's really interesting stuff.
Yeah.
So I think a good place to start is maybe with Jan Duet, kind of our entry point into this story.
Okay.
Johannesburg, 1932.
Okay.
And we find him as a clerk at Volksbank,
Okay.
which you learn is having some difficulties,
Mm-hmm.
and it seems like a small personal moment.
Right.
But then he discovers an old ledger. It belongs to his grandfather, Pieter Duet,
Okay.
from 1833.
Wow.
So you can see how this ledger creates this bridge between the generations.
Right.
This kind of deeper, broader narrative starts to unfold.
Yeah.
So maybe we can start with Jan in 1932. He's at this Volksbank, which we learn is much more than just a place to bank.
Right.
Founded in 1912, the sources describe it as a symbol of Afrikaner resilience.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they faced a lot of challenges in the city at this time.
Right.
And Jan uncovers this really alarming situation, a 4,000-pound deficit.
Wow.
And it seems the financial records have been falsified.
Okay.
So it's important to remember the broader context of 1932, the Great Depression.
Yeah.
This had a really harsh impact
Yeah.
on a lot of Afrikaners.
Hmm.
It contributed to what was known as, at the time, the poor white problem.
Right.
So Volksbank, it wasn't just a bank. It was a vital support structure for this community
Right.
as they navigated this, widespread hardship.
Yeah.
So one thing to think about is how these economic crises really ripple through communities,
Right.
making even these local institutions carry this huge weight of expectation.
Exactly. And Jan, he's immediately in a bind. He feels this deep sense of responsibility to the community. He knows how many families rely on Volksbank, but at the same time, he's clearly terrified of what will happen if he reveals the truth.
Yeah. I mean, this internal conflict really highlights the immense pressures individuals face during this time. On one hand, there's this clear ethical need for honesty, and on the other, you've got a potential for this immediate widespread hardship. If the bank collapses,
Right.
that's a tremendous burden for one person to carry.
Yeah. And then we're introduced to Sarah van der Merwe,
Yes.
and she's urging immediate action, no hesitation. And this is where we see a real contrast in how to handle this crisis.
Definitely. Sarah seems to represent a much more direct approach,
Right.
maybe less emotionally attached.
Okay.
She's really focused on these immediate realities, the potential for even greater damage if the truth is hidden. It makes you consider how different people react under pressure.
Oh, yeah. And then that leads to the confrontation with Willem Botha,
Right.
who is the bank manager. And his solution is to hide this insolvency by selling what he calls toxic assets. Now, I think for anyone who might not be familiar with that term, what exactly are toxic assets?
Well, in this situation, toxic assets, they refer to assets that are very difficult to sell or essentially worthless. So by selling these, Willem's hoping to create this illusion that the bank is solvent,
Okay.
even though the underlying financial problems remain.
Right.
In fact, they're probably going to worsen over time.
Right.
So it's a risky strategy.
It sounds like it. Yeah. A short-term fix that could lead to much bigger problems. So this puts Jan and Sarah in a difficult position.
For sure.
Yeah.
They're faced with this dilemma. Do they go along with this deception,
Right.
which might keep the bank afloat for a little while,
Right.
or risk immediate exposure and the potential devastation? That could follow. A real ethical tightrope walk
Right.
with huge consequences either
Fair.
way.
Yeah.
It makes you think about the ethical responsibilities of individuals
Yeah.
when faced with this kind of financial instability. That impacts a whole community.
Exactly. Okay. Now let's shift back in time.
Okay.
Jan has this ledger, right,
Yeah.
from his grandfather, Pieter de Wet,
Mhm.
1833,
Yeah.
in the Cape Colony.
Yeah.
And the entries initially paint this picture of a prosperous past.
Yeah, it's striking, isn't it,
Yeah.
this contrast with Jan a century later.
Right.
He's facing financial ruin, and Pieter's entries suggest this time of growth. We see that he receives £500 in government stock as compensation for the abolition of slavery.
Which in 1830, yeah, that must have been a lot of money, right?
It was a significant amount. He uses this compensation to buy more land, more livestock, essentially scaling up his farm, building what appears to be a secure financial foundation.
Right.
So it's interesting to think about how even these positive societal shifts, like abolition, can create new realities with complex moral dimensions, and in some cases provide opportunities for some, while leaving others behind.
Right. But there is this sense of unease, even amidst this apparent prosperity. In Pieter's writings, he says, what will become of them? Talking about the newly freed slaves.
This is really key. Even as Pieter benefits, he's got this moral consideration.
Yeah.
He recognizes the precarious situation of these formerly enslaved people who receive no compensation, are left with very few options.
Yeah.
So it makes you think about the uneven distribution of benefits and burdens during these periods of huge change.
And there's a mention of an encounter with a British official, which hints at some underlying tensions, almost like an early indication of these future conflicts to come.
Yeah, I mean, these small interactions foreshadow these larger political and social dynamics that will unfold over the next, century or so.
Yeah.
Ultimately impacting his descendants. So these early tensions are almost like seeds of future conflict.
Right. And this unease in Pieter's story continues to grow. Despite his financial gains, he starts to feel this shame. When he reflects on the situation of former slaves like Janshi and Claus and Sarah.
That's fascinating. Pieter's conscience really starts to develop. He's operating within this system that's historically oppressed people.
Yeah.
And even though the legal framework of slavery has ended, these fundamental inequalities, they persist.
Yeah.
It shows how individual moral compasses can grapple with these broader societal injustices, even when there's personal benefit involved.
Yeah. And then we see Anna, Pieter's wife, offering this more pragmatic view. She urges him to focus on their family's future, making the most of this £500 to secure their well-being.
It's understandable, given the context.
Right.
The immediate concerns of survival would have been paramount. Right. But it sets up this interesting tension between Pieter's unease and the practicalities of building a future. It makes you think about these different priorities people have during these times of big change.
Exactly. Okay, let's move forward a few decades. To around 1896, we encounter this new challenge, the Rinderpest epidemic.
Right.
And there's a Willem
Yeah.
that is introduced in this part of the story. And it makes you wonder if this is an ancestor of the Willem Botha we met in 1932.
It definitely raises the possibility of some family connection within the community's, economic life.
Yeah.
But the Rinderpest itself, it was a catastrophe, this massive impact on Pieter's cattle herds.
Yeah, the sources describe the heat, that smell of decaying animals. It's really vivid.
Yeah.
And it really conveys the scale of this devastation. And this has huge consequences for Pieter and his family.
It does. I mean, the loss of his livestock. It forces Pieter and many others to sell their land. This accelerates the acquisition of land by British interests and contributes to this wider decline.
Right.
This is a real turning point.
Yeah.
Pushing Pieter and his family onto this much more precarious footing.
Yeah. And then just a few years later comes the even greater upheaval of the Second Anglo-Boer War, 1901, 1902.
Yeah.
And this just inflicts deeper and more personal wounds.
Yeah. This period was marked by immense disruption and suffering. We read about British soldiers arriving at Pieter's farm and burning his barn when he refuses to give them supplies.
Right.
This defiance has severe consequences for him and his family.
Right.
And then they're forced to move. Pieter, Anna, and their son Jan, who is, as we know, the father of the Jan we met in 1932.
Right.
A concentration camp.
The conditions in these camps are described as incredibly harsh, disease spreading rapidly.
Yeah. The concentration camps were sites of immense hardship, overcrowding, poor sanitation, and disease was everywhere. The impact on these civilian populations, particularly